Welcome back. We are commencing with chapter 3. In this chapter, we're going to talk about psychoanalytic aspects of personality, and you're going to find that in this chapter, we're going to exclusively talk about Freud. In the next chapter, we'll talk about some of his followers. So let's get started with our discussion of Freud's version of psychoanalytic theory. All right, now if we were in a face-to-face class, I would pass out handout 14-3, but since we are online, let's take the scale together. I think it's important enough that it's worth devoting some lecture time to. So you're going to be seeing 15 questions, so if you want to grab a piece of paper and pencil so you can play along. You're going to indicate the extent to which you agree with each of the following statements using the following response scale. So 1 means that you strongly disagree with the statement, 2 means you disagree, 3 means it's neutral, 4 means you agree, 5 means that you strongly agree. Okay, so those are your number options. Here's the first question. Number 1, events that occurred during childhood have no effect on one's personality in adulthood. Rate your degree of agreement or disagreement with that statement. 2, sexual adjustment is easy for most people. 3, culture and society have evolved as ways to curb human beings' natural aggressiveness. 4, little boys should not become too attached to their mothers. 4, it is possible to deliberately, quote unquote, forget something too painful to remember. 6, people who chronically smoke, eat, or chew gum have some deep psychological problems. 7, competitive people are no more aggressive than non-competitive people. 8, fathers should remain somewhat aloof to their daughters. 9, toilet training is natural and not traumatic for most children. 10, the phallus is a symbol of power. 11, a man who dates a woman old enough to be his mother has problems. 12, there are some women who are best described as being, quote unquote, castrating bitches. 13, dreams merely replay events that occurred during the day and have no deep meaning. 14, there is something wrong with a woman who dates a man who is old enough to be her father. 15, a student who wants to postpone an exam by saying, my grandmother died, should probably be allowed the postponement. Okay, pause me if you need to reflect on any of these questions. I will make a quick definition in number 8. Aloof means to be standing away or not emotionally connected. Number 10, phallus is another word for penis. I think all the other words are self-evident. So if you need to pause me, go ahead and do that. All right, hopefully everybody's back. All right, so how do you score the scale that you just completed? Well, this survey was designed so that a fully invested Freudian psychologist would strongly agree with 9 of the items and strongly disagree with 6 of them. So that means you're going to have to reverse the numbers that you placed in front of the 6 that are disagreement items. So you're going to reverse the numbers that you placed in front of items 1, 2, 7, 9, 13, and 15. So what that means is that if you answered 1, you'll switch that to a 5. If you answered a 2, you're going to switch that to a 4. If you answered 3, it stays the same. If you answered 4, switch it to a 2. 5 switches to a 1. So go ahead and pause me real quickly and go ahead and make those switches. All right, so now you're back or not playing along. Hopefully you've got those items switched. Now, oftentimes I get a question from students whether that switched number is now the answer to the question. And yes, that is now the answer to the question. So whatever you originally gave, you have switched it to what you're now actually going to count as part of your total. To make your total score, now you're going to sum up all the ratings of all the 15 statements into one big number, using the switched numbers for items 1, 2, 7, 9, 13, and 15, and the original numbers for the remainder. All right, so pause me and do your math. All right, hopefully you're back. Now, just to check your math, a good policy is to notice that your score has to be somewhere between 15 and 75. There were 15 questions. The lowest score you could give any individual item was 1. So that means the minimum is 15, and then the maximum was 5. So if you gave everything a 5, then your score would be 75. All right. Sorry, I bumped my desk. All right. Higher scores reflect more agreement with Freudian perspective. So if you have a score that's, closer to 75 than to 15, then you're agreeing more with Freud than disagreeing with him. The halfway point on those would be, I think it's 45. I probably should have prepared this part. If you're, a lot of people are more towards the middle, but a lot of people disagree with a lot of Freudian statements. And so you may have a smaller number, something closer to 15, which means you disagree more than you agree. It's often surprising for my students in face-to-face classes when they realize that they actually agree quite a bit with things that Freud says. A lot of people have been sort of primed from our, sort of cultural discussions of Freud. And if you've taken psychology classes, a lot of times, instructors are a little anti-Freud. And so you might be surprised to find out that there are actually parts of his theory that you agree with. That's not unusual. Some of the stuff he said was kind of logical, or almost sort of like, I can't think of another phrase except for no duh. You're like, well, yeah, of course that's true. Other parts of his theory are much more controversial, and you can, as we go through his theory, you'll start to recognize, some parts probably are more objectionable, and other parts are probably more seemingly just logical. All right. What I usually like to do at this point is lead a little discussion as people can kind of talk about, what factors went into them accepting certain statements or rejecting certain statements, any evidence that could be used to evaluate, whether the statement is true or false in, objective terms. Like, is there any kind of empirical evidence that we could rely on to sort of determine whether it's true that there's something wrong with a woman who dates a man who's as old as her father, and these other statements, right? Like, what kind of evidence would it take to evaluate those things? Is it possible that maybe some of these statements were more true in the past than they are today? Like, maybe some things have changed since Freud initiated his theory, more than 100 years ago now. It's 140 years ago, really, since he wrote his seminal work. So, maybe some things have changed. Would members of other cultures respond differently? Like, maybe this is sort of a westernized way of looking at things, and maybe people from more, Asian or African or South American kind of cultures, would they be more likely to view some of these things differently? And then finally, I like to ask my students to consider whether, just from those statements that you just saw, do you see any evidence of a double standard for male and female behavior? Like some things that are okay for males that aren't okay for females, and vice versa. So these are kind of fun things to consider and think about. Obviously, we can't have a back and forth right now, but at least we can kind of think about these things. So some of the basic tenets of Freud's theory that are evident in that handout that we just did. One is the existence of a life instinct and a death instinct. If you watched my chapter 1 and 2 combo videos, you know that this is what Freud calls our psychic energy. And you can kind of see evidence for that life and death instinct in those questions. You see some evidence, some basic evidence for the idea that if the natural drives that a person has are thwarted, then they'll be expressed indirectly or unconsciously, that those drives will get out, whether the person is trying to, sort of suppress them or not. That we can rely on dreams to provide insight into the unconscious, that we can rely on Freudian slips. My grandmother died. That kind of Freudian slip gives us some insight into the contents of the unconscious. Evidence for psychosexual stages, that, potty training goes easily for most people. That was a statement that relates to that anal stage. So, there's evidence for that. Unresolved conflicts from childhood affecting adult personality. Some of the items pertain to that. Trouble with weaning having, impacts on oral related behaviors like smoking, overeating, gum chewing. Problems with toilet training causing anal expulsive or anal retentive personality. There's little, signs of these things in those questions. And then finally, problems in the phallic stage causing, the Oedipus or Electra complex, castration anxiety in men, penis envy in women. Like you see some evidence of that, of all of these things in that little handout that we just completed. So Freud has these basic beliefs about personality, about healthy versus unhealthy development, about healthy and unhealthy urges, these kinds of things that the writers of that survey attempted to display in those questions. Let's talk about these things a little bit more specifically, though. Well, apparently first we're going to see all the squares. That is not what you're supposed to be seeing right now. That's really interesting. The picture can't be displayed. Well, that's interesting. Why can't the picture be displayed? I just looked at it. All right. Well, I think this is a good time to take a little break, and I will fix my picture problem. All right. I will see you in the next video.